Okay, with that, we are ready to start.
Okay, we will go ahead and get started. I want to call to order the February 22nd meeting of GPAC. It's 6:05, and Renata, if I could ask you to do a roll call just to ensure that we have a quorum, that would be terrific. By the way, we are being recorded and it'll be available on the YouTube channel for the city. So Renata, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Carol Singer is absent. Emma Hunt.
Oh, here.
Thank you. Conrad Brees is absent. Stella Weatherspoon.
Present.
Thank you. Chair Matt Pease.
Present.
Thank you. Beth Needle is excused. Jim Cervantes.
Present.
Thank you. Sarah Blumenfeld and Susie Kelly are both excused. Christine Rasmussen.
Present.
Thank you. Chris Lee.
Present.
Thank you. Planning Commissioner Greg Mason is absent, and Mayor Anduri is absent, but we have Vice Mayor Dawson here in his stead. And that's everybody. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. First order of business is I'd like to have a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Cervantes. Can I have a second?
Second.
Um,
Sorry,
We'll
Stella.
give Chris Lee
Chris can take
the break the tie. And so do we need to have a vote on that, Renata? I didn't
No,
think
we
so.
do not.
Okay. Before we start to move into the meat of what we're going to be meeting about tonight, I wanted to ask if there was any comments from the public on items that are not on the agenda. We'll have plenty of time for a public comment on agenda items, but if anybody from the public wants to comment on something not on the agenda, they should indicate by using the raise hand indicator, and we'll put you on.
So if you would like to make a public comment for an item not on tonight's agenda, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen. And I'm not seeing any hands raised, Chair.
Okay, great. Thank you, Renata. Before we get started with the staff presentations, I wanted to just kind of review kind of what I'm hoping our goals are for tonight. One is to see if we can get close to consensus on the vulnerability analysis. This will be the second review. Many of you have put in comments about, I'll call them minor, they're all important, but edits and things such as that. But the idea is to see if there's any other big items that we need to discuss on the vulnerability analysis, but hopefully we'll be close on consensus there. We're going to do the first feedback on the programs and policies and goals. Those of you who work with different commissions, please make sure that the draft gets to your commission so that they can give us feedback on it. Like I said earlier, what we're going to try to do is make sure we're focused on the big issues, because there's a lot of material here, as most of you have commented. It's pretty deep. And I want to make sure that we use our time in the most valuable way, and that is focusing on some of the big issues that are strategic to our city. So with that, Renata, I'm going to turn it over to you and the professionals from Placework to go through the staff presentation.
Thank you. So as the chair mentioned, so we would be providing a staff presentation and kind of running through our standard protocol of presentation, GPAC questions, public comment, and a discussion. And so I will turn it over to Miles Barker from Placeworks for the presentation. Thank you. And you should be able to share screen now. I just enabled that.
All right. Just
Would it be
Or
helpful
no,
for
I'm
me
having
to?
issues. I'm having issues sharing the screen. Would you mind pulling up the PowerPoint and walking
Sure.
through this?
No problem. That was going to be my next offer. Let me find the latest version. Here we go. Okay. Mhm. So many windows. All right. Everyone can see that okay?
Mhm.
Great. Thank you. All right, Miles, let me know when you want to advance.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Miles Barker. I'm an associate with Placeworks. Tonight, we'll be going over the safety element update, goals and policies, and the progress made so far on the safety element. Next slide, please. All right, so in tonight's meeting, we will be discussing the progress made on the safety element, the latest revisions to the vulnerability assessment, a discussion of the draft goals and policies, and the next steps following this meeting. Next slide, please. So today is the fourth GPAC meeting where we will review the revised vulnerability assessment and discuss the draft goals and policies as well as programs. The fifth GPAC meeting will be on March 21st to review the draft safety element. On March 28th, we will have the second virtual community workshop to cover the draft safety element. The final GPAC meeting on April 18th will cover the revised draft safety element. And then finally, the Planning Commission and the City Council public hearings will be held in May and June. Next slide, please. So here you can see the safety element update process. The safety element update process started with the preparation of a draft vulnerability assessment, as well as the background report that started in the winter of 2022 and 2023. Currently, we are updating information in the vulnerability assessment and background report, as well as preparing goals, policies, and programs. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into the revisions made on the vulnerability assessment. The topics that we will be discussing include comments received from GPAC and city staff, hazard changes, consolidation of populations and assets, scoring revisions and results, and how the VA results fit into draft policies. Next slide, please. So after submitting the initial draft of the vulnerability assessment, we received several comments from the GPAC and city staff. These comments included things like consolidating the number of populations and assets, including extreme temperatures instead of only extreme heat and warm nights, including more community members affected by drought, revising flooding descriptions to be more specific to Lafayette, and considering the Ebmud Mokalume aqueduct under the water facilities when scoring landslides. Next slide, please. So as directed by city staff, we expanded extreme heat and warm nights to include extreme cold. This category is now referred to as extreme temperatures. While many populations and assets in the community are affected by extreme heat events, we concluded that it was appropriate to incorporate extreme cold weather conditions as well. Next slide, please. In an effort to reduce the total number of assets and populations, we consolidated populations and assets into groups where similarities existed. So for example, populations were consolidated by combining seniors with seniors living alone, cost burden households with low-income households and overcrowded households, and immigrant communities with linguistically isolated communities. For buildings and infrastructure, we consolidated by combining government office with community centers and libraries, electrical transmission lines with natural gas pipelines, communication facilities, electric vehicle charging stations with gas stations, major roads and highways with bridges and culverts and transit facilities, adult care and senior living facilities with medical and care facilities, single-family residences with multifamily residences, and bicycling and pedestrian trails with parks and open space. Next slide, please. Economic drivers were consolidated by removing education services and combining outdoor recreation with retail and dining. Ecosystems and natural resources were consolidated by combining riparian areas and creeks with wetlands and vernal pools and chaparral with scrub. Key services were consolidated by combining emergency medical services with public safety response and communication services with energy delivery. Prior to these revisions, there was a total of 61 populations and assets. Now we've reduced that total to an amount of 40 populations and assets combined. Next slide, please. So now we will discuss the scoring revisions made to the populations and assets affected by different hazards. Under drought, we included additional populations as being affected by drought. Some of these populations include children, households with animals, persons experiencing homelessness, persons with chronic illnesses or disabilities, persons without a high school degree, persons without access to lifelines, renters, seniors, and unemployed persons. Under extreme temperatures, we lowered the VA score for commercial centers, homes, major employers, and public transit access. Under flooding, we raised vulnerability scores for persons living on single access roads and seniors. And we lowered vulnerability scores for transit facilities, energy delivery, communication services, and water and wastewater services. We also included government and community facilities, parks and trails, and wildlife corridors as being affected by flooding. Next slide, please. Under human health hazards, landslides, severe weather, and wildfire and smoke, we raised vulnerability scores for seniors. Under landslides, we lowered VA scores for persons living on single access roads and vehicle fuel stations. Next slide, please. Considering those revisions made, the scoring for consolidated groups has remained unchanged or show similar scoring. Wildfire continues to be the most significant threat, presenting the highest vulnerabilities in Lafayette. The most vulnerable populations in the community include low resource people of color, those with chronic illnesses and or disabilities, and seniors. The most vulnerable infrastructure include energy, communication, and transportation. Recreation and tourism remains the most vulnerable economic driver. Riparian areas, creeks, and wetlands are the most vulnerable ecosystems. Energy delivery and communication services remain the most vulnerable key services. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean? The VA assessment, or the vulnerability assessment, analyzes the risk from climate change and allows us to identify how people and key community assets may be affected by climate change. So just as a reminder, assets, we're referring to any non-human aspect or feature of a community. That can include things like buildings, infrastructure, and natural resources. It also includes intangible things such as key community services or important economic sectors. The vulnerability assessment helps us understand who and what in Lafayette is at most risk from climate change, and helps to develop policies in the safety element to address those vulnerabilities while improving resilience for categories such as emergency preparedness and response, flood and inundation hazards, geological hazards, fire hazards, and climate change resilience. In some instances, there are policies and programs in place that are currently helping to protect the community, which we are using as a foundation to build on. The policies and programs also aim to address the comments provided by GPAC and city staff, as well as comments and concerns provided by community members from the previous workshop. In some cases, policies are focused on addressing several vulnerabilities and improving upon adaptive capacity. So for example, policy S1.1, evacuation assistance, addresses safe evacuation for those with limited mobility, lack of access to vehicles, and other at-risk populations. Some policies and programs also align with potential grant and funding opportunities. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into the discussion of draft goals and policies. Next slide. So the draft goals and policies are based on the review of existing policies against state requirements. They aim to integrate the results of the vulnerability assessment. In many instances, we kept or expanded on existing policies where it seemed most appropriate. And some policies also integrate the 2018 Contra Costa County Local Hazard Mitigation Plan. Next slide, please. So as a refresher, I figured it'd be good to go over some definitions before we go into the review of goals and policies as well as programs. So for example, a goal is a general direction setter. It would be an ideal future and related to the public, safety, or general welfare. A goal is general expression of the community values. And so therefore, goals may be abstract in nature, but ultimately a goal is generally not quantifiable or time dependent. A policy is a specific statement that guides decision making. Policies indicate a commitment of the local legislative body to a particular course of action. A policy is based on and helps implement a general plan's vision. And then a program is an action, procedure, or technique that carries out a general plan policy. Next slide, please. So the focus of our discussion today includes policy topics, the consistency with the city's vision, including goals and policies, and addressing the natural and human caused hazards in Lafayette. So ultimately, what we would like to consider moving forward in this discussion is is there anything missing or not addressed? These can include different policies for various hazards. Should anything be pushed further? Should anything be made more limited? Is there anything that is not feasible? What are barriers to feasibility of those policies? And do the goals, policies, and programs support everything that the community should be doing to improve resilience and address hazards that are known within Lafayette? Our focus tonight is not to wordsmith the policies. So if you have any revisions to those policies, we welcome your input, but we'd also appreciate it if you could send them after the meeting in the consolidated list where we can work on collectively revising different policies. Next slide, please. So the goal topics we will be discussing include emergency preparation and response, flood and inundation hazards, seismic and geologic hazards, fire hazards, hazardous waste and materials, and climate change resilience. Next slide, please. Before we discuss draft goals and policies, we also thought it might be important to share some of the questions and comments received from GPAC. Here you can see a list of various questions and comments. There's certainly more that will be raised, but because we received these prior to the meeting, we thought it'd be beneficial to cover these and just bring awareness to all those who are listening and participating in this meeting. So I'll start off by reading some of the questions and comments. The first being, what is the best way to use the vulnerability assessment analysis in determining goals, policies, and programs? How does the scoring best translate into those goals, policies, and programs? Program S-2.3.4, public education on responsibilities for community members that have property next to streams. This is in regards to, excuse me, this is in regards to how my community members be responsible for streams that impact or are related to flooding and other related impacts. Are there more programs and policies besides policy S-1.4 and policy S-6.1 to reach marginal populations? Why were police services removed? And this is in regards to largely the background report. There's a question and comment regarding fire drills for multifamily projects. Multilingual educational materials as part of policy S-4.12, and some other minor suggestions regarding wording and typographical errors. So again, we don't need to go over all the comments and questions, but it's just important to let those that are listening be aware of what's been raised so far. Next steps. So we're going to start off with emergency preparation and response. Goal S-1, a community that effectively prepares for and responds to natural and human-caused disasters, avoiding loss of life and minimizing the impacts to health, property, and community welfare. We're not listing all the policies because a lot of these can be lengthy and time-consuming, so we would like to just go over anything that is of concern to you, but generally what they cover are these bulleted items here.
Miles, if I could pause for a second. Renata, I think Carol's in the waiting room. If you could add her, please. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Miles. Keep going.
So yeah, we're gonna stay here on this slide, and moving forward, we're going to go through each individual section of those hazards that are covered in the safety element update, and just open it up to people that would like to comment on any policies regarding this topic.
Miles, just a point of clarification. I talked to Renata about this earlier. I think what we're going to try to do first is make sure we've got all the questions out there, and maybe you can answer them if you've got quick answers for both the vulnerability assessment and the programs and policies. Then we'll go to public comments, and then we'll come back to GPAC, and then we'll give you guys more feedback and comments on those programs and policies. Does that sync up okay with you?
Yeah, I might recommend we just go to like the next step slide, and then we can pull these up during questions.
Sure. Yeah, we can
as
come back.
reference. Okay.
Yeah, we can come back.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm just going to skip ahead because these are just summaries of the goals.
Okay, great. So I'll cover briefly the next steps of the safety element update process. Next slide, please. So over the course of the next month, we're going to be preparing the draft safety element. And then on March 28th, we will have the second virtual community workshop to cover the draft safety element. As of today, next to the star, you can see that we're working through the draft goals and policies. And as we mentioned earlier, we will be going into public hearing draft safety element in April, public commission hearing in May, and then ultimately the city council adoption in June of this year.
And if I can just jump in, so Miles, correct me if I'm wrong. So the next meeting on March 21st will be GPAC's review of the complete draft element. And so we've already reviewed several of the main components of that. And so there will be, I believe, the biggest part that GPAC hasn't seen yet will be the background report. And so that's kind of the technical context laying and like data background that informs or sets the scene for the rest of the safety element. So I just want to make sure none of you are super scared about March. You will have seen a lot of it before multiple times, but there will be that new element of new piece, which is the background report.
Correct. It's the more technical component of the report. So in the meantime, we'll be updating any concerns or comments that City or GPAC has, and it won't be anything new that you haven't seen.
Yeah, so comments received tonight we'll incorporate to the complete draft element before it comes back to GPAC. Okay. And I will say one more thing. So ahead of March, we will have this discussion tonight. We'll be writing furiously, taking down notes throughout our discussion and our questions. But if there are additional suggestions or recommendations from GPAC members, we would like to have those to staff no later than Tuesday, February 28th. So that just ensures that we can keep on track and incorporate those changes with enough time for that March meeting. So, if you have smaller suggestions, like we said, wordsmithing, feel free to send those by email to me by the 28th. All right, and with that, I think we can conclude the presentation. Is that correct, Miles?
Yeah, why don't we, for the GPAC team, why don't we move into just questions? We'll get to feedback later, but right now, just questions that you've got about both the vulnerability assessment as well as the policies, programs, and goals. And like I said, we're trying to keep this those that are going to be impactful and really strategically address what the city is trying to do here. So I will open it up for the GPAC for any questions.
And Chair, may I make a
Yes.
request on behalf of staff? If at all possible, we could start with the vulnerability assessment and then move to the goals, policies, and programs. That would just help
Sure.
us keep more organized with our notes.
Okay,
Thank you.
so let's start with the questions on the vulnerability assessment, the second draft that we've got. The chair recognizes Carol Singer. Good evening, Carol.
Thank you. I'm sorry to have been late. I don't know why I had it in my head. It started at 7. Yes, on the populations, I had a question about the seniors. Why was senior living alone taken off? Because it's certainly different from just seniors 65 plus. I mean, is that because the decision was made not to distinguish between seniors living alone and seniors living with family? It's just all seniors, period, regardless of where they are, though we do take out, call out seniors in facilities. And most of those people are over 65.
Miles, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so, our goal was to ultimately consolidate a lot of the populations and assets. And so we combined populations and assets where it seemed that most of those populations and assets shared similarities. And generally speaking, the seniors and seniors living alone had similar impact scores and adaptive capacity scores for various hazards. Within those impact scores and assessments that we make for that population, we do call out seniors living alone, as well as just seniors in general. So, ultimately our goal was to consolidate a lot of those populations and assets. It's not that we wanted to single anyone out, but with regards to senior care living facilities, that we're looking at more as structures or infrastructure with assets within the community rather than populations.
But senior living alone is out, right? Got
No,
a line crossed out on my page 51.
yeah, so we combine that as one entire category, seniors and seniors living alone.
So it was merged with another group, Carol, and was just removed as its own population.
Which group though? Meaning senior 65 plus? Is that the-
Correct. We merged seniors living alone with seniors 65 and older.
Okay, well, I noticed Arinda still had the 2 groups in there, so I sort of wondered. Okay,
Yeah, it was at the direction of city staff that we consolidated a lot of populations and assets, because before we had roughly 61 populations and assets, and ultimately our goal was to reduce that.
Yeah, it was actually GPAC at the last
Oh,
meeting.
GPAC,
That's
sorry.
like, whoa, is there a lot?
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Christine?
Hi. So I'm still feeling that this list of populations is still a little bit too nitpicky. I really don't understand why, for example, unemployed persons is in here. Why is that not considered? Because we could be unemployed, but the more better off are not going to have a problem with with finance, or I just feel like some of these things are captured within the cost burden, low income, overcrowded households, households in poverty. And I don't understand why we've broken it down that much. Can you explain why we can't have that combined? And that also goes for low resource people of color. I just don't understand why they wouldn't be captured in cost burden, low income, overcrowded households, or households in poverty, or in seniors, or even persons experiencing homeless, or the other categories. Why are things like that still out there? It seems awfully nitpicky. Can you explain?
Yeah, our goal was to, retain a lot of the unique populations within the community. We can certainly take a look at that again and see if there's anything that we can combine or merge with other groups. But
They're
we
just being
felt,
captured so many other places. That's why I just hate to go down these rabbit holes when they're being captured multiple times in other places.
Yeah,
And a person with a high school degree, same thing. I mean, there could be a high resource person who didn't go to college, right? I mean, didn't we have like some of these tech guys? They have plenty of money, and it's silly to even have it in here when the persons that are having no high school degree would also be captured in cost burden, low income, overcrowded households, et cetera.
So I think PlaceWorks is working off of kind of best practices throughout their experience doing several safety elements and trying to, like Miles said, highlight those unique populations that have where the impact and adaptive capacity was different from those similar populations. So, he pointed
But
to,
the reasoning
I'm sorry, can
behind
I
it is very
finish
similar.
speaking?
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
thank you.
sorry.
Thank you. And so trying to merge them in that way. Yes, I understand some of the scores are different, but the ways in which those populations might adapt, I think would be one of the differences. But to Chair Pease's point at the beginning, I think we want to try and keep a high level view of how this vulnerability assessment outcomes is informing our goals, policies, and programs, right? Because in these draft programs and policies, it's not like we're intending to create a program or a policy specific like for each of these populations and assets, right? It's more general and high level than that. And so, I think PlaceWorks has tried to address that concern and has taken it as far as their professional experience they feel warrants, or the consolidation was warranted. And we might want to keep in mind kind of the level of impact, what would further consolidation change as far as the goals, policy, and programs, right? Because that's the ultimate outcome as action items.
I understand what you're saying, but I also believe that by watering it down like this, that we're going to be losing focus on certain groups. For example, unemployed persons. So are you going to tell me that housewives in Lafayette are a population when they're or house man, whatever, when their spouse is, making plenty of money to have the family and they're not in the overcrowded household. So what I would like to do is just have it not so watered down so that the correct groups will be receiving what they need rather than it being spent somewhere else, if you see what I'm saying. So I would still like to revisit trying to reduce the amount so we can focus in on truly who needs it rather than having it kind of spread apart into different like nitpicky little groups because it just waters it down. I'm also concerned about the single access roads. I wrote a letter to you all asking if we might add something about rural neighborhoods. I have one where in my Burton Valley, and I've also located a few that are in different areas in Lafayette that, people on septic systems, people that are on wells, they are kind of disconnected from the rest of the main roads, and I'm very concerned about leaving them out. I had a conversation with someone out in the Hunsaker area who basically told me they have their own arrangement with the fire department, and that's interesting, but it makes me wonder, have we left them out? I don't know if single access roads is adequate enough because they're way up in the hills up there. Yes, they do have a single access road, but it's a little bit more complex than that. So can you tell me why we wouldn't want to do that? More rural community or more rural neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's something that we can certainly revisit. It was sort of our understanding that Lafayette isn't very rural in many aspects. So if we want to maybe recategorize that or rephrase how we would like to address those living in more remote areas of the community, we can do that.
Actually, that actually sounds good. Maybe remote might be a better
Mhm.
word.
Yeah, I think
To add on there,
remote would
single
be
access
appropriate.
roads and remote, that could possibly work, but rural also works for me too.
Okay.
Okay,
Christine,
and that's just for the populations, right? Okay, and then I guess that's about it. All right, thank you.
thank you, Christine. Christine,
Or
Chris Lee?
Chris?
Chris Lee?
Oh, sorry. Also on the vulnerability assessment, I just wanted to kind of pull out the picture here because it lists 19 populations, and but we haven't looked at what percentage of Lafayette's population these 19 groups are. And so when I read the populations, I was like, oh my gosh, I mean, how many people in this community fit these categories? And I can't help but think that has some effect on what the policies, goals and programs would be. So if we're talking about, let's say all of these populations equals, we have 25,000 people. Let's say it equals 2,000 people. Does that make a difference? I guess. How would you look at that, knowing that the vulnerable population is a very small number of the total population? I mean, how would you get a handle on that?
I think it's difficult, one, to parse out percentages of various populations within a community. We can certainly try to narrow that down, but I don't see that affecting policy, at least on a higher level, too much.
But especially with the 65-year-olds, I think there are a number of people on this committee that would be in that group, but we probably don't. I don't know about the vulnerability scale.
Yeah,
for a lot of 65 pluses in Lafayette.
Yeah,
So,
and that's certainly something that we can get a percentage on. And I think generally speaking, a lot of the policies do address, or there are policies that do address, hazards in relationship to how that might affect senior citizens within the community, certainly with evacuation assistance and other resources. Right. I guess that's what I'm getting at. If you reduce it to numbers and percentages, you kind of lose the, the dimension of this other dimension about who these people really are and how they are living. So. Right. And in policy, we try to keep at a higher level, but we also understand that when we do develop or draft a policy, that we're hoping to capture those that are at most risk without needing to calculate those percentages. Right. Okay. Just want to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank
you. Carol, you have another question?
Yes, I think Christine brings up an interesting point I hadn't thought of. What about the rest of us who don't fit these categories or any of these population categories? That'd be a good many people in my neighborhood of 65 homes. Okay, some have a chronic illness. I don't think a lot of them are households with animals. Certainly none in poverty. So now what about the rest of us, like my neighborhood then? What? So there's nothing about how climate change affects the 65 homes, which maybe 150 people that live in my neighborhood. I sort of think that's maybe what Christine was after, or is the vulnerability assessment only supposed to address populations that might be vulnerable? I mean, my neighborhood certainly vulnerable to drought and severe storms and wildfires, certainly.
Carol,
Right, and
Carol,
go
can you
ahead.
frame that? Could you frame that question up one final time for me? I'm not sure what the question is.
Okay, well, I think Christine sort of brought it up. There's a very small percentage of the population of Lafayette, probably all these categories. So I'm looking at my neighborhood, Silver Spring. There's 65 homes in here. So probably over 100 people for sure. Very few of these people, of these populations, live in my neighborhood, probably, except households with animals. There may be some with a chronic illness or disabilities. But so the people in my neighborhood, their vulnerability to wildfire, particularly storms, extreme temperatures, is not being analyzed. So if the vulnerability sort of drives the safety element, then is our safety considered? Does that make sense? I think that's what Christine raised in my mind when she said, this is a very small percentage of the people in Lafayette, judging by the 65 homes in my neighborhood. So where is the vulnerability for all the people in my neighborhood? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So the impacts that we're reviewing are community-wide. So we compare that against certain populations. The VA is helping us to screen people in places that are most vulnerable. So those populations that we had just described. And that allows us to be sure that we can focus on improving the resilience of those populations. And we evaluate what their current adaptive capacity is and how we can improve upon that.
Well, I hear that, but we're very vulnerable to wildfire, probably in a lot more of these groups. We have the big Los Trompas wilderness behind us. Okay, I just sort of curious there.
Jim?
Thank you, Chair Pease. So I want to make sure, my question is, in effect, what is this climate vulnerability assessment? My understanding is that we're doing this pursuant to state law. That requirement did not exist when the general plan was last updated. There was a safety element. So the goals, policies, and programs was in place. We're modifying those. But the climate assessment, vulnerability assessment is a newer thing. So we're satisfying state law, is my understanding. So it exists, but the key is the safety element with the goals, policies, and programs, which addresses a broader scope of the population. So the question I'm trying to work to edge in here is that so why are we doing the vulnerability assessment? I think the answer is doing it because we have to, because we're following state law. So it's helpful, but the key for all the work we're doing is really the safety element itself. Is that so?
That's correct. And
Yeah.
I would just like to emphasize that the vulnerability assessment isn't constraining anything within the safety element. So the safety element goes beyond the vulnerability assessment. It just helps us to inform draft goals and policies and perhaps what populations are most at risk and how we can improve upon that.
So then the last part is so then, if I can frame this as a question, so the key is not to obsess about the vulnerability assessment, get it close enough. The thing to obsess about is the safety element.
Right.
That's
We
kind-
really want to hone in on those goals, policies, and programs and how that can inform the safety element moving forward.
Thank you.
Stella,
Thanks. So just one thought on the vulnerability assessment populations. It seems like a missing one is anyone who lives within the very high fire hazard severity zone, because they would presumably be very, very affected by wildfire. And really, there's not too much adaptive capacity, I think, for a very large wildfire. And it popped into my head just based on what Carol was saying about sort of what about the rest of the population that's not in these categories. But I understand what Jim is saying about this is just sort of a template that the state's given us, and really where we need to focus is on the actual goals, policies, and programs that will pertain to everyone in the city, both anyone who's in this list of populations as well as not in the list of populations. So am I hearing that right, or am I connecting?
You are. And
The
that's a
ideas
good point
right?
that you bring up, those populations that live in high risk areas for wildfire. Because generally speaking, the community is at very high risk in most areas. So what we can do, it doesn't always have to be reflected in the vulnerability assessment, but what we can do is draft policy to address wildfire hazards for the community at large.
Right. Okay. And see those in the goals, policies, and programs. Okay. And then the last question on wildfire. Does that include air quality and smoke? And would that be written out or described in the narrative?
Yeah, I believe we have one policy somewhere that addresses air quality, in particular,
Do
PM 2.5. And then in the background report, the more technical section will deal with wildfire and smoke, as well as air quality in relation to wildfire and smoke.
Okay. Yep. No, you're right. I see it for air quality event assistance. Very good. Okay. Thank you.
thank you, Stella. Chris Lee.
Oh, yeah, I was listening to Carol wrestle with the populations versus it doesn't cover everybody in Lafayette. But the way I look at it is that you want to make sure you cover everybody you can possibly think of that would be living in a town like Lafayette. So if you name this list of 19 and you don't appear on the list, there's no quality that you have. You're going to be taken care of by the safety element anyway. But the idea is to make sure that the safety element has the goals, policies, and programs to get everybody who's here.
Correct.
And we're just trying to, right now, through the vulnerability assessment, just trying to qualify that a little better so that the goals, policies, and programs can address it more specifically. And the rest of us are, I shouldn't say us, because I'm over 65. So I appreciate that they're on the list. But the rest of the population is already taken care of by taking care of these groups.
Right. And if there are
Is that
uniquely
correct?
affected populations, this vulnerability assessment helps inform policy that can take care of those populations or assets.
And in doing so, it takes care of the rest of us.
Correct.
Takes care of the rest of the population. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I rest my case.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Seeing no other hands, I just had one question, Miles, is when you looked at all of the affected population, all the populations you identified, how did you determine how to translate those into programs? What's the connection between them? How do you make that translation from populations and assets into programs?
It's a very good question. And, we try to develop policy or programs that are at a higher level that also capture those populations. Generally speaking, we might have some policies that take care of households with, large animals or pets, populations that are at higher risk with lower resources within the community that might be evacuation constrained. So there's policies there to also deal with those populations in any event for an emergency within the community. Now, if there's some population that you feel needs to be specifically addressed in a policy, we can certainly do that.
Yeah, well, I'll get into that in the comments towards the end there, but okay, I understand. Any other questions before we open it up for public comments? Going once, going twice. Renata, you have a question?
Yes, Chair. I would recommend that we go through questions with the goals, policies, and programs before moving to public comment, and
Oh,
then
good.
move to
I
our
thought we were
discussion.
I thought we were doing both, but thank you for the clarification.
Sure. Yeah.
So let me make sure that everybody's clear that we're also trying to get questions for staff on not just the vulnerability, but also the policies, goals, and programs. So are there any questions on those areas from GPAC?
Oh,
Christine, you're up first.
Christine Lee or Christine Rasmussen? Which one?
Christine Rasmussen.
So I sent in a map that I was hoping was distributed to the GPAC. Has everybody seen that one from the CAPUC? Did no one get that?
No, I did not get a chance to send that out today. My apologies.
Okay, so I think that's kind of an important one. So I'd appreciate it if that would go out sooner rather than later. That one coming from, and Stella, of course, you can chime in on this one. I would like that included in the packet. That one is from the California Public Utilities Commission, and it has different fire maps than the ones that we have. And considering that the fires have been caused by PG&E, a lot of the big ones, that I think it's important that we have that map included, and I think that might help the city decide also when we're figuring out how these policies and procedures are going to be executed after seeing that as well. So I'd like that included in there. That's one thing. And then the other thing is the earthquake, is that not a threat to us, or is that just kind of covered in seismic, what is it, seismic and geological hazards? Is that kind of covered in there, or I don't remember reading anything.
Yeah, earthquake risk is covered in seismic and geological hazards.
Okay, somehow I missed that. Okay, just wanted to make sure it was in there. Okay, that's and then so are we just like asking general questions and then we'll go back in and talk about these things? Is this how we're doing that, Matt?
Yeah, these are just questions right now, and we'll go back to feedback and comments after we have public comment. So these are just questions right now that you're trying to get clarification.
Okay, all right, that's good for now. I have a few more, but
Okay, thank you. Chris Lee.
oh yeah, I actually have a lot of questions and comments on the safety element update.
Let's just keep it to questions at this point.
Okay, are we going to go through the maps and be able to ask questions?
We can do that now.
Okay. Let's see. All right.
Tell you what, while you're looking those up, Chris, maybe I'll
Okay.
ask Vice Mayor Dawson if she's got a question.
Okay.
Okay, that'll give you a minute to get that together.
Okay.
So Vice Mayor Dawson, if you have a question.
Thanks, Matt. Actually, Christine's question kind of spurred my thought on this. In terms of those CPUC maps, those are basically fire threat maps based on the infrastructure of PG&E's electrical infrastructure. So wherever that is, that increases the risk of fire, which is different from the CAL FIRE severity maps. So my question is, when you think of hazardous sites, would that qualify? You know, how would that factor in? Because it's infrastructure, but it's also particularly like the gas regulator station, that's a hazardous site. That's a, would that be considered a hazardous site as an asset, or the infrastructure itself would be? I'm just curious if people look at it that way, because obviously it's true. We had a fire and it was caused by PG&E's infrastructure. So I'm just curious if that would factor in to be listed as a under hazardous site, or is that, at least the gas would be, I would think.
Tammy, do you have any response for this?
Yeah, I can. Hi, everybody. Tammy Seal here, helping out with the PlaceWorks team. And so as part of the vulnerability assessment that Miles and the team prepared, we did look at the energy infrastructure, parts of that energy infrastructure system. So each part of it was evaluated against each hazard that could occur, and had the severity of that hazard, its ability to withstand and recover from the hazard. So I think we did very likely determine that the energy infrastructure is highly vulnerable. So that's a pretty regular finding for many of the reasons that you were alluding to. So in our policies, we would want to address the infrastructure to the extent that the city has authority to do so. So those are, we have to limit what we look at to what we can control through the city's, land use authority or other authorities, and then also defer to the entities that own those systems to do their work as well. And so PG&E is required to do its own vulnerability assessment, and they're working through that, and they're going to have their adaptation plan as well. So we'll focus on where the city has control, but we also recognize that PG&E will be doing some of this similar work.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious. I understand that because we are trying to work on forwarding some work with PG&E. But other than that, would those, like the gas regulation station, would that be a hazardous site? I'm just asking in terms of an asset that we would list as something that's.
Yeah, it would at least be listed under energy infrastructure, whether it gets deemed hazardous by the state. Like we have a whole group, a state definition of what's a hazardous facility or material. So it's tricky that within a plan where we're talking about hazards, there are varying definitions of the natural and then the human caused ones. But we do try to look at each of those types of sites and ensure that going through this process, we are protecting the community from impacts to those sites. So, we do want to make sure that we've done that in this plan. And if we haven't, to be able to add some policies or programs to the community.
Oh, I appreciate that. It's just a newer asset since outside of the existing infrastructure. So thank you.
Thank you. Chris Lee, let's, if you're ready, we'll return to you.
I am ready. The maps that I had questions on were the landslide susceptibility map. And it looks, like this. So basically all of Lafayette, well, except for the downtown area a little bit, is susceptible to landslides. And I'm wondering if they're on this map, is it all landslides caused by anything, or is it landslides that are susceptible to rain, or is it landslides that might occur as a result of an earthquake? That's one question.
No, that's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I have a clear answer for you, but I would assume that based off the mapping from the Geological Survey, these areas are typically areas that are susceptible based on their soil conditions, slope, topography, etc. So I'm not sure whether that's factored in for other hazards, but this is the data that we do have to work with. Okay, so it's just mainly based on slope. Right, slope, soil conditions. Okay, all right, and then the liquefaction map kind of scared me because my house is in that area. I was told that this area was on clay soil,
And that is not that's not the kind of soil that would liquefy in an earthquake. I'm not sure. It's like the map actually spreads across Lafayette. It kind of makes a cross. It's got a horizontal and then kind of a diagonal intersecting it. Sorry. So I'm wondering, and there are a lot of business, it's most of the downtown, it's down Pleasant Hill Road. Is that a function of the soil that part of the city is built?
Yeah, I believe that's part of how, liquefaction is evaluated, those areas that are susceptible. But
Mhm.
generally these could be saturated soils with high groundwater as well.
Oh.
So what you see is, I believe in that map, a lot of the high liquefaction areas are along the creeks
Yes.
where ground is saturated.
Yeah, that I also noticed that it's along the creeks. So the soils are highly saturated then. Okay, all right. And then my last question on one of the maps is it's the wildfire burn area, but it only goes to 2010. And we have actually had some wildfires since then. I'm wondering if there's a more updated map.
I recall that question coming up recently. Renata, do you recall? I think Eli had clarified that for us in regards to why this map shows.
Yeah,
wildfire burn
I had the
areas.
exact same question
Mhm.
as you, Christine. So let me pull that up real quick. Eli did provide a clarification. Okay. So the most recent fire mapped in the area was in 2004 near Martinez. And so there's only there's like a size threshold for CAL FIRE to map fires of us within their database.
Mhm.
And so there haven't been any that kind of met that threshold since 2010.
Oh, okay.
So that's why there's no data, more current data, is because they weren't substantive enough.
Well, that's good news in a way. Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, Stella.
Thank you. I have a number of questions. Let me try to find my first one. So I noticed in the Orinda policies, there's the very first one, policy S1. I won't read it, but it's very kind of broad and talks about coordination with the county and Governor's Office of Emergency Services, FEMA, to basically coordinate and assist in 8 different activities after a disaster, like clearance of debris, heavy rescue and heavy search and rescue, fire suppression, hazmat response, temporary shelter, geologic and engineering needs, traffic and crowd control, and building inspection. And so I saw that and thought, well, that's pretty nice and overarching and seems central. And I didn't see it in the draft for Lafayette. So is there a reason, or?
It just there's actually no reason why it wasn't included. But if that's a policy that you would like us to include, we can certainly take a look at that and then revise it in a way that makes it more specific to the community.
Okay, well, thank you. That's helpful information. I've got some small questions, but let me just go through them here. So program S112 describes large animals. And is that the term for things like livestock, hooved animals, et cetera? Is that like the technical term?
No, it's not a technical term, but we after discussing it internally, we figured that it'd be most appropriate because when we talked about livestock or things of that nature, we felt that it might be a little bit too restrictive. So we figured that large animals might encompass more than just livestock if that were to exist.
Okay. Yeah, I just asked because it could be a Great Dane, which may or may not have its own unique
and pets are also part of that category for that policy. So we figured that dogs would be addressed in that situation.
Yeah, as a pet. Yeah, okay. Well, I just raise it because I think in one of the, or a few of the zoning designations, there is an allowance for a certain number of animals of hooved feet, I believe, or with hooves. So, I mean, if we have that, I guess seems like it would be important to make a parallel in
We
the
can,
safety element.
we can make a note of that, and then we can revisit it as we make revisions to the policies and see where that fits in best.
Okay, that sounds good.
Just,
Yeah.
just to make
Yeah.
it consistent with the zoning.
Yeah, and I haven't looked at that in a while, so I don't remember the exact term or phrase, but I believe it has to do something with you need to live in a certain zone to have hooved animals. Let's see. Sorry, I've got my whole list here with comments and questions mixed, so I'm kind of skimming through to find the questions. This may be a question for the later discussion for Renata, which is how does the hillside development ordinance interface with the seismic and geologic hazard goals, policies, and programs? Maybe I'll throw that out there just as a
when you say interface, what do you mean? Like, are there conflicts, or do those regions overlap, like on a map?
Well, I know that they do in some places, but they don't in others, I think. Although looking at that landslide susceptibility map, it seems like there's probably 100% overlap. But no, I just wondered because there's description about policies with respect to cut and fill, I believe, and drainage or roadways. Like prohibit new roadways or roadway modifications that would create unstable geologic conditions. That's policy S3.3. And so it occurred to me, because I think there are regulations in the hillside development ordinance for altering land that has a certain slope, exceeds a certain slope.
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar, the city has a designated hillside overlay district that has more particular and stringent development standards to protect hillside slope stability, preserve kind of the natural characteristics of those areas, and has protected ridge lines. And so there are regulations therein to restrict development in areas with a 15-degree declination, so like very steep slopes and such. So they do merge with my review of the goals, policies, and programs. They do align in the intention, and it's just that the zoning is like the next level of detail below the general plan that gets into those specifics.
Okay, I think I understand. Thank you, that's helpful. I guess I'm wondering also, what are the geologic hazards other than unstable soil and landslides? Are there any?
I think we define that in the background report, but generally speaking, geologic hazards in Lafayette include landslides and erosion. Those are the two primary hazards with respect to geologic hazards.
Okay. Thank you, that's helpful. Let's see. Looking for my general questions. Yeah, I mean, I have some that might just be, I should save until the later part, like one program, is it CONFIRE responsibility? Is it city responsibility? Those kind of things. So maybe I'll just wait until we get to our discussion.
Okay, before we get to public comments, I just had one question. Miles, do you have any examples of cities of our size that have had programs and policies for evacuation drills or fire drills for high density buildings? People that might have 50 units per acre, which by our standards would be big. Renata and I had a discussion about that, and she was rightly concerned whether our staff has the resources to do that. And I'm just wondering if there's other cities of our size that maybe have pulled that off successfully that we might be able to learn from.
I don't have any, I don't know of any in particular. I'll let Tammy speak to that given her experience in other locations. But one thing, as you mentioned, that we do want to be concerned about is staff resources within the city.
Okay.
Yeah, so there are other communities, incorporated cities and rural unincorporated communities that have conducted fire drills. Some of them have been like live and some have been virtual. We've seen a bunch of different, ways to go about this. And the policies or programs that kind of set those up often might be in other documents, especially like this jurisdiction's emergency operations plan. And they can happen, they can be led by police or fire departments or fire districts. They often require a cooperation of a number of entities to happen. So I think that's it is an emerging best practice. It is staff intensive. And so I think for a policy or program suggestion like that, we might want to make sure that all the likely partners could support city to do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're at about 7:15, so we're still into questions here. Christine, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. I had a couple questions. I just wanted the Emergency Operations Center, is that going to be a particular place, or is that something that just is created for the use at the time? So if it's a fire, it might be somewhere, and then if it's a flood, it would be somewhere else, or is that one place and then you do satellite places, or what does that mean exactly? An Emergency Operations Center.
Yes, so I can answer this one. In Lafayette, our Emergency Operations Center is activated when so directed by City Council in the case of an emergency. It is usually housed within the library downtown. It's a central location. They have backup internet. I believe they have multiple internet providers lines into the building to make sure don't lose that resource. And so if there are backup locations, I think like the community center or other similar facilities in the case that the library is not a viable EOC.
Okay, so that's the one that we've chosen to be the EOC first, and then anything else would change that. Okay, I got that. Okay, and then another question I had was sort of a little bit similar to what Stella was talking about. So when we have these policies that we put in, I think what the climate change resilience, for example, I think we wrote somewhere about having new buildings, having, I guess it was like water conservation. I can't remember where it was exactly, but basically, to have permeable land. I can't remember what it's called, but anyway, to capture water and do all these other things to save water or to keep runoff from affecting other properties or whatnot. Now, those policies that we set in place, I know that the building, when a big developer comes in, they can take concessions, I guess. Would they be able to change any of these things that we've put in these policies, or would these be untouchable? Because I guess I get worried about, we make these really good plans and then a developer comes in and says, I'd like that as a concession, for the density bonus or something. So are these going to be, they'll be rock solid. They won't be able to change these, because I think a lot of these things, that's important that we can count on that. Is that?
Yeah,
Maybe that
so
doesn't matter in this,
developers
but I'm just
can, as part of state density bonus, developers can seek concessions on waivers on local requirements with regards to like zoning standards or certain other requirements like public art or open space. And so they can kind of reduce those. However, with regards to things like stormwater control and management, there are other state regulations called C3 regulations for to track and regulate the development projects that kind of increase stormwater runoff and so forth. And so those remain in place and actually were just updated to become more stringent. And so all those projects are still reviewed by the city engineer for conformance with those kinds of other regulations.
Okay, so if we have something that's more restrictive, we wouldn't be able to necessarily make the developer do it then, unless it's the state forces them.
We definitely, if it's a policy, it's something that we can encourage, but if it's not a strict if it's not a development standard, then it's not a concession or a waiver or a bull item. It cannot be waived.
Cannot
That
be
makes
waived.
sense.
Okay,
Yeah.
mhm, okay, thank you.
Okay, Chris Lee.
Matt, you brought up something that I had written down about whether or not it's possible to do a work, and I wasn't thinking of a real live event, but I was thinking more of modeling to do different worst case scenarios for evacuation of Lafayette, given what, fire, let's say fire. But it would really involve Moraga and Orinda because roads that we might have to evacuate Lafayette from would then affect Moraga, for instance. So I'm wondering if that's something that we can start thinking about. I don't know how that would be done. I don't know if PlaceWorks knows a group, or maybe UC Berkeley students can do something like that, where we can give them a set of constraints and they can model different possibilities.
So we did actually do that as part of the housing element. There is another state requirement for evacuation modeling analysis. And I think it's SB 747 is the number. I think SB or AB, whichever. But it basically requires cities to conduct analyses to evaluate potential pinch points. And so we undertook that with the transportation consulting firm Fair and Peers. And then we worked with the fire and police departments to create 3 scenarios of worst case, absolute worst case. Everyone, usually evacuations are done in stages. It was kind of like whole swaths of the city are leaving all at once.
Right.
So it's already information that we've done to comply with state law. But I can look that up for you and circulate that if you'd like.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Sure.
Okay.
I know Stella
thank you.
dug it out of the at one point.
Thank you.
In the EIR, right?
Mhm.
Oh,
Way
okay.
deep in the EIR. Yeah, that would be great if you could send it to GPAC. I think it would
All right.
be of interest.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, and I believe in that modeling, our figures for potential evacuation routes are also consistent with the primary emergency access and evacuation routes within the community. So we've also considered that as well.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Renata, what I'd like to do is move to questions and comments from the public. I know there's one hand already raised by Don Eames. So if you want to go ahead and let people know how to make themselves available, and we'll get public comments.
Sure thing. So if you would like to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen. And I will allow you to speak for 3 minutes. So first up is Don Eames, followed by Cheryl.
Hi, good evening. I was
Hi, Don.
interested, hi. I was interested, like Christine Rasmussen, about earthquakes being included in geological hazards, and wondering if the Lettuce earthquake study back in, I think, February of 2006 could be viewed, and if the current traffic safety study information that was online recently will be reviewed or included to be reviewed. comment.
Miles, do you have any background on that or?
You know, I'm not aware of that study, but we can take a look into it.
It's LETTIS. And it was
Yes,
February 2006.
Yes, so we do have that on file and have provided it to Placeworks, but I think it was captured within the fault that was studied in that study. It was captured in the quaternary faults map, and so that kind of data is involved in the background report, and ultimately kind of the scope of action is within these goals, policies, and programs. And so we've incorporated best practices to address any seismic hazards such as those faults.
Okay, and there were several maps that I was looking at from the traffic safety information. There was going to be a meeting, I guess, the 27th of February that had a lot of maps about different geologic hazards, I believe.
Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Don.
All right, next up is Cheryl, followed by David Clark.
Hi, Cheryl. There we go.
Well, really quick, the thing that Estelle was talking about, and that and Chris was talking about, that you all want sent, is there a way that can be, available to the public on GPAC site or something like that? As a citizen, I would be interested in it as well. That'd be great. With the seismic talk, I looked in the maps, and there are like 5 or 6 earthquake fault lines that run through Lafayette, and there's no map that shows them. And I think that's really important to include where they are. There's one I know on the east side of Lafayette. There's one that I think runs through BART. I don't know where they all are, but I think a map that includes that map would be great. And I think it should be part of that so we all can see it. Part of my questions are, we're going to make this beautiful report, and how are we going to make it happen are my questions. So like, who's going to reach out to the HOAs and make these neighborhoods leads, and transparency and communication. There's a white paper that was created a long time ago, years ago, that was all about transparency and communication. How are we going to make those things happen? So I guess my question is, where does it go from here? We make this report, and then how do we put it into action? If you could clarify that in the future conversation tonight, that'd be great. Is Mount Dell Boulevard now a evacuation route formally? And if so, can that be mentioned? And then one of the things under the fire area, fire hazards, are we going to include anything about the working on a fire station with a hook and ladder truck? And can you expand on what it means to improve access and response times of emergency personnel? Should it include apparatus such as fire trucks? So I understand that the people are on the fire trucks, but I just wanted to know if it should be more clear. And that would also maybe help with the response times, which is in 5.4.1.3, if I got that right. And then defensible space. Oh, I have 30 seconds. Staff has very limited time, I understand that, but not everybody has the ability to maybe financially, it's a lucrative city, but not everybody necessarily has the finances to cut down a really big tree or two. So I asked if there was a possibility to look into grants from the state and the feds to see if there would be a way to finance that. That would be great. Okay, I guess I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl.
Went as fast as I could. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. And next up is David Clark.
Hi, David.
Hey, Jim. Hi, everybody. I'm not intentionally hiding my face. Well, you can't see me anyway. I've got a couple of comments, and they're a little bit, they're kind of a little bit scattered, but just to go through these, they're all comments with respect to policies. So the first one is a policy S 2.1, and there's a program to update the municipal code. And I'll just point out really quickly that on the Creeks Committee, as you probably know, we've been working for more than 5 years on trying to get the Downtown Creeks Plan implemented. And most of the guts of what is in the Downtown Creeks Plan is in Chapter 6 of the Lafayette Municipal Code, and that's a flood damage prevention ordinance. There's another chapter though that deals with stormwater discharge. It's Chapter 5-4. So when you look at the municipal code, I think the types of risks that you've got here, that you've explained here, are probably in both of those code sections. So just heads up, there are a couple of code sections in the Lafayette Municipal Code where that might be impacted by this. That's one thing. The other is the Chapter 6, the revisions that the Creeks Committee made are going to go before the city council, probably the next council meeting. My point is just that they're in the process of being changed. So what's in the Lafayette Municipal Code right now may not be what's there in another month or so. So heads up that those, you probably need to look at the changed version because there are some changes. I'll save that till the end. But, policy S-2.5. The creek maintenance. This says develop a creek maintenance program, and it just triggered a couple of things for me. The last Creeks Committee we had a resident who owns a home on a creek called and asked what she can do because there's now a 10-foot wooden staircase deposited on her property by virtue of the flow down the creek. It's not hers. It came from somewhere upstream. So whose responsibility is it to get rid of that? Well, at this point, it's hers. But at some other point, it was wherever it belonged upstream. So what we we tried to point out was that the ownership of the property, it's a homeowner's responsibility along the creek side to keep the property clean and to follow the law with respect to easements, for example. So we got a lot of feedback from staff about there's not much they can do about that besides go out and take pictures. We don't have any creek police. So in terms of enforcement, there's some practical challenges that are going to have to be addressed. It's in the state law. I mean, it's both the civil code and the penal code. It's a violation. So there's that. And the very last thing in 12 seconds is policy S-3.4, the creek setback, the recognition of, it says prohibit structures of any kind. Our existing law has an exception which allows structures. So these two are going to have to be meshed up because this policy actually contravenes the municipal code as it stands now. And there's a lot more here, and I'd be happy to talk about it, but obviously I'm out of time for now. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And certainly if you want to submit that online, the rest of your feedback, please feel free to do that. Okay, let's bring it back to GPAC. And what we'd like to do now is to kind of come up with the final recommendations and comments now that you've gotten some of your questions answered to staff on things that we'd like them to consider. So this is more just kind of giving them feedback and direction that they can use to incorporate into the next draft. So who would like to go first? Jim Cervantes.
Thank you, Chair Pease. I guess one quick question first. Do you want to knock out this climate change vulnerability assessment first? And then
we can start. We can start with that, and then go to programs and policies. That'd be fine.
Okay, just the thing, like if we can, I think we might be close to getting done with that.
Yeah,
so I'll try to be quick on this thing. I was one of the advocates for trying to collapse as many categories as possible from the prior draft. It was kind of frankly maddening to see all the umpteen categories that we had, and I really want to thank PlaceWorks and staff for working to sort of make this more manageable. You know, they're probably, I could see tightening this further, as some others have indicated, but I kind of feel, look, we're close enough. Let's just move on, because the key, I think, is really the safety element itself. Maybe a couple of thoughts on this would be, I kind of hear what Christine Rasmussen was saying about people living in more remote areas, and maybe we can manage that by combining that with people living on single access roads. There's an overlap there, I think. and maybe that works. The other point that Stella raised, I thought was a good one, which is kind of maybe calling out people living in the very high fire hazard severity zone, which is a good chunk of the city. And just given the particulars of Lafayette, it's probably worth kind of noting. It gets picked up later on in the safety element, but those are the two changes I thought made sense. I've submitted a bunch of comments on this to staff. I'm not going to belabor it at this meeting. The one question I had, which is I thought maybe worth throwing out to Placeworks here, is this is on like page 47. We talk about wildfire and smoke. Grasslands, you assign like a V3 category to. We don't have a lot of grasslands in the city. It's more of the area around Briones. But as someone who sits adjacent to that, and my community or neighborhood does, that's the one thing which is kind of scary, which is if the grasslands in Briones start to go, it may be hard to stop that. So I kind of think that I'd maybe just ask staff and Placeworks to think about that as to whether that merits something higher, because that to me would be really a meaningful risk if indeed you got a wildfire going in October of a given year after a very dry summer. And with that, those are my comments. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Emma.
Oh, I just had a comment about one of the populations. It was about the kids one, and it was if they're under 10 years old. And I feel like that could be expanded to potentially under 16, because I feel like that might represent the kids' lack of awareness, which they might get later on. But then, like when you're 16, you're still dependent on your parents for transportation. So in the event of an emergency, you'd be helpless. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Emma. Stella.
Thanks. I just follow up to what Jim was saying about perhaps highlighting people living in the very high fire hazard severity zone areas. I would include the wildland urban interface zones as well. So populations living within.
Okay. Okay, and then the one thing I'd like to add on the vulnerability is if we do decide to do a rural access that's a little bit more expansive than just the single lane road, I would encourage Placework to define rural a bit more specifically. We've used the term in this town rural and semi-rural quite a bit, and it means different things to different people. So I would encourage you, if you go down that path, to define what that really means. I think that'll help policymakers and staff to implement accordingly. So that would be my suggestion there. And finally, on the populations, I agree with Jim. I wouldn't want to go to the mat on this, but I still think there's too many. And if you condense it down a little bit more, do some sizing estimates, I think it's going to help City Council to decide where to devote resources, because we're always faced with limited resources. And I think if we can define these populations a little bit more precisely, even if they're ranges, I think it's going to help people down the road as they decide, how to fund policies and programs and things such as that. Emma, you still have your hand up. Did you have another comment?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess it's sort of a clarification question, but I know last meeting I brought up adding like endangered species, but could we not necessarily include it now, but then add it in later when when we get more in depth about that sort of thing?
Renata, do you have any insight there?
Well, I think now is the time when we are in depth because we're heading towards a draft.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an idea of where in the vulnerability assessment you think that could go? Any suggestions for us?
I know they had like a wildlife corridor, but I think that was under the environmental. I'll have to look at my notes, but under the environmental and section of it, I'll have to look at that. Maybe I can send you an email later. But yeah, I think it's pretty important. I know Arinda had it in there, or I think Moraga actually. So
Okay, we can look into
Okay.
that.
Thank you. Okay, there's Christine.
Again, so I let's see where I lost my form here. For the populations and assets, oh, I think Jim mentioned it. For the ecosystems and natural resources, also the grasslands and the oak woodlands, I think I moved everything up to 4 or more on, especially for fire and wildfire, I think it was. And I noticed that I don't think it was high enough. So I agree with Jim. You know, I've got a lot of open space where I am. I've got a lot of grassy hillsides. So that definitely needs to be moved up to a higher level. And anyway, of course, now I can't find my notes. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. I agree with Jim and everyone else. I think all the comments have been really good. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, with that, why don't we move to comments and feedback on the goals, policies, and programs?
Yeah,
Jim?
so sorry,
Oh.
before we jump into it, I just want to reiterate, what we're hoping to address here for goals and policies. So just keep in mind whether there's anything missing or not addressed currently that we have drafted. If there's anything that needs to be pushed out a little bit further, should anything be made more limited? Is there anything that is not feasible? Certainly something to consider when implementing policy. And then potentially what are the barriers to the feasibility of those policies or programs? And then lastly, do the goals, policies, and programs support everything that Lafayette should be doing to improve community resilience and address hazards? So those are just things to keep in mind when we start to discuss any suggestions or revisions.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
Thank you, Chair. I'm wondering does it make sense to maybe break this into sections?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm at the smorgasbord and I don't know where to start. But it might be helpful just to digest this meal if we kind of break it into chunks, work through that, and then move on to the next one. Does that make sense?
Sure, we can do that. I think if I'm following you, Jim, we can go through each of the categories. There's emergency preparedness, which is pages 1 through 4.
Right.
Flood hazards 5 through 7. And so there are 5 categories there that we'll go through. So
yeah, if you'd like,
why don't we start off with emergency preparedness then?
Yeah, we can also bring up the PowerPoint in case you want to revisit each of those sections. It does, we've got bullet points that discuss generally what those policies aim to address, and then the overarching goal.
Yeah, why don't you do that? Let's see if we can take a look at that.
And then
Renata, can you bring that up?
There we go.
Okay. So Jim, you want to go?
Yeah, thank you. So I thought basically that the bulk of this was pretty well directed. And I was kind of trying to think like, what are we missing anything? And it came back to something, there was some discussion about this months ago, which were, there are 2 risks, and I think it fits in this category. Maybe it doesn't, but there are risks out there that aren't addressed in this and weren't in the prior safety element, particularly gas transmission pipelines, and maybe to a lesser degree, the EB mud aqueduct lines, those big high pressure lines that kind of run through the middle of the city. But, after the San Bruno disaster some years ago with that gas transmission line, it seems to be that's something it's amiss. And maybe it's in this category. But I kind of think that that's something that whether it's in this section or maybe elsewhere, we ought to be including it, because that's we've already seen it manifest itself as a potential for something really serious, and I think we're overlooking it if we don't do that. Away from that, for this particular section, I've got comments I submitted to Renata earlier, and I'm content to let it go with that. But those are my main items in this section. Thank you, Matt.
Okay, thank you. Stella, anything on this category?
Yeah, I do. I agree with Jim and what he had said about finding a way to add a policy with respect to gas transmission pipelines and Edmund aqueducts. And I also wonder about adding something in about the CPUC high fire threat districts that were previously discussed. So I think including the maps in the report would be useful, but I also wonder if there's a policy that would link to that. And as I understand it, those zones or districts were developed by the utilities and CPUC to identify places where the utilities should perform more mitigation to reduce the risk of their infrastructure causing fires. So they're important. It's an important new zone that I guess we have on the table with respect to fire risk. But I was surprised to see that a decent number of residential communities in Lafayette are in those CPUC high fire threat districts. So I would encourage us to try to find a way to work that in. I think there should also be some kind of policy that supports citizens with respect to the effects of PG&E, power safety, forget now, is it power? The PSPS, sorry, I can't think of the acronym. As well as extended unplanned power edges, which we have a lot of in Lafayette. I think certain neighborhoods more than others. And so I know PG&E does their share and has a program, but I think that there's a role for the city to play as perhaps advocates or supporting residents in those circumstances, and maybe interfacing with PG&E with respect to or in support of residents. For the other areas, I'm wondering for program S1 2.1, just have to get it out here. Sorry, it's very hard to read the red line. Dude. Okay, it's the upgrade the existing EOC and alternative EOC sites to be resilient to potential hazards located outside of mapped hazard prone areas. And so my question is, what are the mapped hazard prone areas? Is it all of the maps that we have in the draft? I think it should be. We already talked about large animals in that program. And then I think that program S1 13.3, again, I've got to find. Should include improvement of emergency evacuation routes. So perhaps maintain an emergency evacuation route system and improve function of routes as feasible would be my suggestion.
Yeah.
That's what I have on that section.
Okay. Carol.
I think I'm lost here. The document I'm looking at dated February, I thought it was the one that came in the packet, but you just showed 7 policies. What I'm looking at has 15 policies. Is that the red line? It's dated February 22nd, 2023. Yes.
Correct.
Is
Yes.
that what
So
we're talking about?
yes, we are going through the red line document, but the slide provided was just a summarized overview of this goal and its policies. So as Miles said in the presentation, which I think you might have missed, it wasn't a precise translation onto that slide. So apologies for the confusion.
Oh,
But we are going through this red line document right now.
okay. Then I have a question. Can I do that? Policy S, I think it's 1.2. ensure that Lafayette has adequate and well-equipped critical facilities. It seems to me critical facilities should have some definition. What are critical facility? What are considered critical facility? I could give you a list, but what are they really? That's one comment I had. Another comment under policy S14.4. The next to the last sentence lists crime. It says, educational and informational material should be available in multiple languages and formats appropriate for people with access and functional needs, and focus on methods to reduce the dangers from natural and human-caused hazards, crime, and promote neighborhood, etc. I don't think we're going to give education and informational materials on crime, are we? Are we? Is it that really means crime? On methods to reduce the dangers from crime?
Miles, why was that in there?
I believe that we are working with an existing policy, so it was left in there. It could be raising awareness for crime prevention of neighborhoods. So, we could take a look at that and revise it accordingly.
Yeah, I don't think it makes sense the way it is for crime. Okay, those are my two comments.
Anything else, Carol?
No, thank you.
Okay, Christine, again.
So I'm looking at the program S1.1.1, conduct regular training programs for personnel. Is that standard to have emergency training not occur for a new hire for a year? Or is that, and then refresh your training courses every 5 years? Is that something that is normal for most emergency operation plans? I don't know what it is normally, but it seems kind of long that, you'd have people waiting a year before for new people.
So that has historically been the city's practice. We actually just did one in November, I believe, at the library. And it is pretty resource intensive to conduct those trainings, since effectively the city more or less shuts down for over a morning to do that training. So, I think that is, as we discussed earlier, the implementation and feasibility of these things. There are some real constraints on it, but it is a thorough training, and also there is, systems and procedures in place for when the EOC is activated to help staff get up to speed quickly.
Okay.
And then I guess once again, then let's see, reviewing periodically. So the next one down, that S1.1.2. So review periodically and revise as appropriate the city's emergency operations plan. So is that like what will trigger a review? Is that something that, is it like we have a new building in town that's got, I don't know, 7 stories tall? Would that trigger a review, or how does that, what does that periodic mean?
So as you can probably tell from this discussion, there's a lot of agencies doing a lot of different work, but we do coordinate amongst one another. So something that might trigger review and revision of the EOP, emergency operations plan, might be revisions to the county's local hazard mitigation plan. And so if they have other best practices or mitigations that they want cities to implement, that might be a reason that it would be reviewed.
Okay, so it'll happen enough to make a difference then. Okay, good. Let's see here. And then, so under the S1.4, there was something about neighborhood groups, prevention and emergency response programs. would that include sort of like the neighborhood watch programs, kind of where you have, I think Jim did one actually for his neighborhood where they did something about, can you do that, Jim, where you did a fire prevention?
That was
something or other?
Firewise, and I've got a suggestion
Firewise,
later
right.
on.
Oh, you were going to suggest that later on? Okay. So anyway, I was wondering if that's the kind of stuff you were talking about for, in that section where it'd be like neighborhood groups and trying to help them organize emergency response within the neighborhoods. Is that what that
Yes.
means? Okay, good.
Yes, and
Okay.
that was a big piece of feedback we took away from the workshop was
Great.
interest in kind of helping organize more locally.
Perfect. And then the last thing was for the evacuation routes, and I think I heard it before, was that policy S1.14. This is in coordination with Moraga, correct? When we do these evacuation routes, and that's standard for creating them, right? That's the evacuation routes identify, coordinate with emergency responders and Caltrans. So that kind of stuff would all include Moraga in there too.
Yes.
Okay. Good. All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Before I go to Chris Lee, I just want to let people know we're at the top of the 8 o'clock hour. Are we okay to go for another half hour?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll say silence is acceptance. So Chris Lee.
So I think some of my comments I can just email to Renata tomorrow, if that's okay.
That'd be fine.
Okay, I'll do that to save time.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Stella?
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to mention, I may have, well, when I described that policy about evacuation routes, I called it S1.13.1, but it's actually under the policy S1.14. So just wanted to clarify that for PlaceWorks to be able to find the one that I was referring to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So we've gone through emergency preparedness. The next one was flood innovation and hazards. Any comments or feedback on that category? Stella?
Yeah, I think maybe we already addressed this, but I'll just run through really quick. So I think we talked about the issue with keeping the creeks clear of debris. And I know I saw that during our January storms. The city had written many times that it's property owners' responsibility to keep creeks clear. But in one of the policies, S234, I think it refers to getting permits from 4 agencies. Is that for a different scope of work? So S2, program S2 3.4.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like
Yes.
development building?
Yeah, it's more for development and construction, or if people are trying to like channelize those creeks, that kind of level of work, but removal of debris and that kind of maintenance. That will definitely clarify that language. But yeah, this is something I developed with
Okay.
Mike Moran, and so I think we just
Okay.
we're too focused.
No, that's fine, because I can see that, yeah, it is under the storm drainage system policy. So the work is storm drainage maintenance or storm drainage work. Okay, that is helpful. And then I think that maybe a public comment from David Clark referenced policy S2.5 with respect to developed creek maintenance program that reduces flooding by removing debris from creeks. And again, as I understood it from the city communication in January, it was the residents' responsibility, but it seems like a very difficult thing to do for a resident. And maybe if they knew more about how to do it or whom to engage to do the work, what guidelines there are, what best practices, et cetera, that would be a helpful program to add.
Good.
And I'm not sure where this came up. Maybe there isn't a program right now for this, but with respect to flooding and storms, we had a lot of storm drains blocked in January. And I saw San Francisco had a really cute adopt a drain program where they basically get people to sign up. They get to name the drain, and then they, in exchange for that, get to clean it up or clear it whenever is needed. And so I don't know. I just wondered if maybe a program like that would be something the Public Works group might consider as a way to engage residents in helping
I think it's a
with
great
that
idea.
maintenance. Yeah, yeah. The SF program is really cute. There's a website. You can look at all the names.
I saw that.
Did you see the names? Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
adorable.
people go crazy with that. It's pretty
Yeah.
cute. And then there's a program S2 4.3 that just didn't seem to fit under the policy that it's nested under about financing the storm drain system. That's just an editorial note. And that's all I got on floods.
Okay. Chris Lee.
Yeah, this is a subject near and dear to my heart because in January, the creek that runs behind our house was at one of the highest points it's ever been. And when it came back down, there was a bunch of trash at the bottom of the creek. So I totally support what David Clark said. So I think I would like to follow up on that, with city employees. But let me see if I have any changes. Okay, I just want to make a distinction between flood and inundation. So my understanding is that a flood is where there's already a body of water, but there's too much water, so that body of water has flooded. And then inundation would be where there was no water, now there is. Is that pretty much the difference? So for instance, if the Lafayette Reservoir Dam broke and all the water came out, that would be an inundation. And
Yeah,
then
so-
a creek overrunning its banks would be a flood.
Yeah, so flooding generally refers to temporary overflow of water onto land that's normally dry, whereas inundation refers to the permanent or long-term submersion of land or structures by water. And that can be caused by natural processes such as, sea level rise, which won't occur in your community, but it can be gradual or sudden.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll give my other comments to Renata because they're fairly innocuous.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Next is seismic and geographic hazards. Stella.
Thank you. I have an overall question about Orinda's element, and they have a policy regarding geologic studies for structures within half-mile of quaternary faults. And my question is, why not Lafayette?
There's not a reason for why it wasn't in there, but if that's a policy that you would like, we can certainly include that.
So I think as far as an implementation standpoint, I can follow up. We can follow up with Orinda on this, but I'm given the other programs and policies and like the building code standards for building within areas with seismic risk. There was another program that we revised to try and reduce the burden on property owners because we felt that another study might be overly redundant and create kind of a burden and barrier to conducting work. I think if someone's doing a 500 square foot addition to their home, that might be, that study might not fundamentally change the way that it's built or where things are built if those risks are addressed through other mechanisms. But I can reach out to Orinda and see if they have done that and if it was helpful. But we can definitely consider it. But I just want to give that full context.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Yeah, I'd be curious to know just, yeah, how they decide or how they use that information, what their requirements are, just how that policy is implemented.
Okay.
So thank you. I think that's all I have.
Okay, Jim.
Thank you, Chair Peace. Yeah, actually, I wanted to touch, Stella raised this, and I thought it's worth spending just a second on this. I mean, there are requirements for limitations on these Alcospriolo study zones, and there is one out in Concord that the map in our sheet included. There are a couple of fault lines that would seem to run through Lafayette. I have no idea what a quaternary fault line is, but maybe that's what these would be. I guess I'm become super cautious. If you're building a home to the code, then acknowledging California's got faults all over the place, and there may be faults that exist that we don't even know about. Just adding in my pushback on the idea of doing what Arinda did would be, we just layer on more stuff that one has to go through to do things to build anything or remodel a home in the city. I think if it really adds a ton of value, then yeah, that sounds good. But to do it just to do it, I'm be concerned about that. Acknowledging that California's got a pretty rigorous building code already with respect to seismic. So, I mean, just to kind of frame that, I think raised a good point. I think that could be a big a thing to chew on, and we might want to think carefully about whether we do that or not.
And Jim, just to clarify, quaternary faults are those faults that are considered to be active. So meaning that they moved sometime within the past 1.6 million years.
Wow.
I'm glad someone was checking that 1.6 million years ago. Thanks.
Geologic terms, it's not very long.
Okay.
Okay. Now their hands up. Next category, last two, hazardous waste and materials.
Chair, I think goal 4 is about fire hazards, actually.
Oh, sorry, I wrote them down wrong. Go ahead. Say that again.
Fire hazards
There
is
we
goal
go.
4.
Okay, fire hazards. Thank you. Jim.
Thank you, Chair Peace. This is where I think I had the bulk of my comments. The first one is, I think we should add a policy that where the city indicates that it would support the development of fire-wise neighborhoods. And that's something that Arinda and Moraga have done pretty aggressively by virtue of the Moraga-Arinda Fire Protection District. We form one in our neighborhood. There's a few that are popping up. I think it's a valuable tool, and the city should be supporting that. So I would suggest that we, somewhere in this, that we pick that up. In terms of other comments on this section, there's a few items I flagged, and I sent this to Renato. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to follow through on this. I think some duplicative items in this, or policies, I should say. In terms of the stuff that maybe we're talking about, couple of things, one of which is policy S4-.10, new development require review of planning department. It talks about conceptual landscaping plans, or having the city review conceptual landscaping plans. And I guess my question is, does the city do that now?
Yes. So when a development when a development proposal is of a certain scope and scale that it would trigger a permit or required review from the city, landscape plans are reviewed as part of that for water consumption primarily. But we don't currently have any standards for landscaping with regards to fire mitigation. So we do get standard comments from the fire district for development saying maintain defensible space and like that kind of stuff, but there's not any specific criteria for that review. So we do review it, but I think for different things, and we typically do look for native species that are more suited for this environment. That being said, we do have a tree protection ordinance that we are planning to update with that, those kind of mitigations in mind, of more like right now a bay laurel is a protected species in our ordinance, and that is actually an extreme fire hazard. And so we want to try and adjust for those kinds of changes.
So I guess, and not to get into the weeds on this thing, but it's, if you're putting on an addition to your home, or maybe putting an ADU in the backyard, are those things that trigger this, or is it more like if you're doing a really new construction or something really substantial? I guess I'm just trying to get a sense of what the impact is.
Yeah, so I think that's something that we could perhaps revise this program or policy to be more clear about, is what would trigger this review. And maybe there's a program to develop standards for certain kinds of projects for wildfire mitigation through landscaping. The way I read it, new development would be kind of like a new home or, you know, multifamily building.
Right.
But that is definitely something we can consider.
Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, if it's new development and you're reviewing it and doing it anyway, then there's no change. Again, I'm just thinking like adding yet another layer of review, which means staff time and cost and delay for someone who's trying to put an ADU in or whatever, I think would be counterproductive for the incremental gain. So I would just flag that as a cautionary note. And then the last one is with respect to policy S4.16, retrofitting city-owned roadways, which makes sense. And then, but the text goes on to talk about identify existing public and private roadways. And then it talks about require private property owners to do the same with respect to retrofitting. And there are a lot of private roadways in Lafayette. There's a map that, because in my neighborhood, we talked about that after the damage from the major storm in January, but having the city take over our major road, and which I think would cause a heart attack for the city's finances. But there are lots of private roads. The question is, can the city require homeowners to do something about their roads? Because I can tell you from just our little neighborhood trying to fix our road, it's hard to get consensus. I don't know what the tool is the city uses for that, absent the city taking over the roads. So I think this might be a case of overreach unless there's already something existing, in which case it's probably not enforced. So I guess I would say there should be tread cautiously on this one unless the city's willing to take over the roads and then do what they want to. Then the city can do what it wants to do. So does the city have any sway over private roads to force homeowners to do things?
No sway, but there is the self-interest of safety, right? So I think you're correct in the case that the city wouldn't necessarily be the one that would have imposable standards. I think more likely that would come through the fire district and their kind of egress routes. I think there was, I can't remember if the bill passed, but there was a bill that would effectively, if anyone was getting a building permit, they'd have to improve a private road to access their home. And so that would be quite a big barrier. And so I think we can revise the language to be less, we can encourage private property owners as feasible.
Yeah, I think it's just, I would say just be careful in this one. I mean, if you want to put an ADU in to further affordable housing and you're being required to fix part of your private road, it's an extra $25,000 or maybe more on top of the job. It's like, we need to be, I think, really conscious of what we're trying to do here. And I looked at this and thought, wow, this could be a Pandora's box if the city wanted to fall through. So that was my other comment on this section. Thank you.
Thank you. Stella.
Thank you. I'll just start with that last comment, policy that Jim just spoke about. It does say at the very end of the first sentence, to the extent resources are available. So I don't think it says it's a mandate to identify them and bring them up to a certain standard. But I think that the intent and the purpose is a good one. That of course we want to have fire access, fire safety and suppression access to all residents. And so I would put that out there, I guess, as a counterpoint to Jim's point. So for the fire section, let me just go back to my beginning of my notes. I think in some places or in a couple places, there's a reference to the figure 8, the wildfire hazard severity zone map. And I guess this is my thing, Renata knows, some of you know, those maps are imminently going to be reissued. And so I think that if this safety element is adopted prior to that, that there should be language in it that includes a note that says this is a 2007 map, and that when a 2023 or 24 map is released, that will become the referenced map for the policies in the document.
Okay.
And I wondered about which of the policies and programs should be applied to the WUIs as well as the high fire hazard severity zones.
Say that again.
Many of the policies in this section describe the zones, and in many of them it's the high fire hazard severity zone. And it seems that the WUI, the wildfire urban interface, I'm sorry, I said WUI, not the name, is also a very important physical characteristic that confers risk. And so so my feeling would be that should refer to WUI as well as the high fire hazard severity zones.
Yeah, so this is something that we considered in developing these policies and programs, but as demonstrated in the maps, so much of the city is in a WUI. We became concerned about the potential implications that applying those programs and requirements to so much of the city might create. And so we did reach out to somebody at the fire district to kind of get them to weigh in on that. So Greg is out this week and he was kind of the one facilitating that. And so I'm going to try and follow up with them to get a better understanding of where they might feel that would be appropriate. But we had some reservations about the extensiveness of the WUI and feasibility of implementation for a lot of these.
Yeah, no, I understand. I mean, when I saw the map, I was pretty surprised myself. And I went into the Orinda safety element to look at what their policies were. And they applied the fire hazard section, the policies in the fire hazard section related to or were using the WUI as well as the fire hazard severity zones. Orinda also, it looks like, is entirely in a WUI. And so obviously, I guess they've made the decision in their community that that's an important characteristic and that requires that level of policy and review. And I guess the question I want to throw out there is, should Lafayette as well? I mean, I know we have ConFire as our fire protection agency, but they're focused on a very broad terrain, not only on our location, on the unique characteristics of our location. And so that's why I wanted to bring up the question. And I guess I'll look forward to hearing when Greg gets back from some of the other conversations you described. Couple questions on some of the programs. I saw 2 were deleted, S4 2.7 and 2.8. And they have to do with fire safety ordinance requiring sprinkler systems and development proposals beyond 5-minute response time, or where insufficient fire flow exists. Are those taken over by ConFire? Are those
more so the fire code, like state requirements for buildings have kind of superseded those requirements in the time that since 2002 when this was drafted. Is that right, Miles?
Oh,
Is that accurate?
oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, we had these in originally, and then when we submitted and reviewed the policies and programs, I think that was our rationale.
okay, okay, got it. So then it's just not part of the current process. Okay. Program S4 2.8. Sorry, I wrote down 2.8, but I think it's okay. It's the new 2.8. Sorry, I'm getting myself a little bit mixed up with the red lines. Hard to read the numbers. The program that says for structures within or adjacent to hazardous areas require a greater degree of fire resistance and roof coverings, etc. So hazardous areas, I think it should be defined more clearly. So is it the very high fire hazard severity zones? Because it's just not, it's not specific.
Yeah, so if you have other minor edits like that, I mean, do you have other minor edits like that? We're happy to take them and follow up with you separately. But are there other more content?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that, I mean, I guess the overall thing is that I was confused in the section about what are the zones. It's not always consistent, and I can definitely send you the details, but that's just the overall. So is it WUI? Is it high fire hazard severity zones? One area says high zones, but that's, anywho, it's not consistent. And I think that overall it should be made consistent so that the meaning is really clear. Let's see. And then last thing, I think on the map for the WUI, I would love it if it would break out the categories of the intermix and the interface.
Okay.
And I will send the rest of my fire hazard comments separately.
Okay, thank you. Chris Lee.
I have just two questions. The first is on, let's see, S4.7, defensible space assistance. This says that there'll be some provision for elderly residents and persons with access and functional needs, that they will receive resources for maintaining defensible space around their homes. Can you go into this in a little more detail?
Yeah, I think this was a recommendation, a policy recommendation, and as far as resources go, I think it's intentionally broad, so that depending on what types of resources the city has access to, depending on funding or staffing, would be open to interpretation and allow more flexibility. If you would like, we can certainly identify what those resources could be, if anybody has any feedback on that.
Yeah, I'm just by having this in as a policy, it could be misconstrued that the city will somehow pay for older citizens to maintain a defensible space. It's leading. I guess that's my concern.
One other, Chris?
Yes. 4.2.7, establish a program that requires property owners to remove dead trees within 90 days of notice. That I'm not sure. I mean, can the city do that? Because that's depending on the tree, that could be a $10,000 bill.
Or a $20,000.
Yeah.
1,000 is a little tree.
Yeah.
Yes, so there are sections of our municipal code, which the city does enforce, about maintenance of like vegetation maintenance and removal. So technically it is an enforceable part of our muni code to make sure that, there aren't dead limbs falling off and breaking, or overgrown lawns creating a fire hazard, that kind of stuff. So that's why we also encourage people to maintain their trees, their pruning, and you know, that kind of preventative management before it gets to that state.
But if it was in, if it was just in the safety element, how do people know that that is a requirement? I mean, what's the consequence if they don't remove it?
Either they would be, I mean, we obviously work with folks before we get to the point of issuing a notice. Our code enforcement officer, JB, is very communicative and thorough and trying to work with people before getting the point of a formal notice. But the penalty is either fines or holds, so people cannot pull building permits until they address the issue, or sometimes the city will do the work and then charge the owner back.
They do.
I don't know, to me, it seems a little harsh. And it's actually buried, it's not a, it's buried as a program. So I'm not sure how would that be broadcast to Lafayette citizens.
Well, I mean, like we're doing, like we do informational campaigns, or we're proposing doing informational campaigns for creek maintenance. Our communications analyst, Suzanne Erla, is very effective at fire prevention awareness programming. And so I think, like I said, we want to prevent people getting to this point of getting a notice. And so doing more early education and management would be the tact.
I think somebody brought up earlier that to encourage people to take care of their trees, that there could be some fund or something that would encourage them to take advantage of any monies available to help them do that. I just see that as it's just a huge cost, and a lot of people don't. I mean, my neighbor, his dead tree came down in the storm, and now it's our problem because it's on our property. But you know, it's going to stay there until he removes it. So it's just a very fraught issue. It's a neighbor issue. It's a money issue. It's just, I think it's just a can of worms. I don't know.
Okay. Anything else, Chris?
That is it.
Okay. Vice Mayor Dawson.
Thanks. Just a quick one. I just want to mention, because I can follow up in email, but policy S4.17, underground power lines. I would suggest maybe that's reversed. Perhaps like consult and coordinate with PG&E to understand and support mitigation of fire risk. And then undergrounding would be a part of that to talk about, as well as, you know, obviously this is part of our priorities right now. Utility safety is part of wildfire safety, and it will be important to keep those communications open. So somehow, you know, that consult and coordinate should be part of that policy as the first, and then anything below that. That's what we're working on now, actually, is reporting of their transmission lines, that the city can at least ensure they're following state guidelines. So part of that would just be consulting with them. I would just flip the priority of that.
Okay.
I mean, just a suggestion, because that's such an important piece of fire safety.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think the next one, and correct me if I'm wrong or not, the next one I've got is the hazardous materials category. Any comments or suggestions on that? Okay. And then the final one I've got is climate resilience. Okay. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. We got two. There we go, Jim.
I'm sorry, this is real quick. There are terms in this like resilience hubs and so on that I think mean something. But to most people really don't. And my one suggestion was that we maybe have a glossary at the end of this, which explains what some of these key terms are. So I think the reader can understand what's being recommended. And
Jim,
that's across the whole piece.
great suggestion. Would you prefer possibly a text box? Because we've done that in the past where we have definitions that sit next to policies or paragraphs that support the narrative.
Yeah.
Okay.
That sounds more like 2020s than what I was thinking of, but
Okay.
that's good.
Okay, thank you. Stella?
Yeah, thanks. So for the climate change resilience program S6, 8.2 and 8.3, I think those are ones that EBMUD currently offers. And I certainly would hope that the city wouldn't be tasked with developing a landscape improvement program for residential properties.
Yeah, so we kind of already do through that water efficiency landscape ordinance that's required by the state. So our environmental task force worked through the ordinance, and staff is currently preparing all the documentation to start requiring that. So, but we already require people to provide water usage calculations as part of their landscape plans for development.
Right, but information about native and drought-resistant species. I guess the point just being that I think EBMUD's providing some of this service, and so
Sure.
if it's a resource out there, then use it. I have a couple of others that are not climate change. Should I hold until?
Why don't you
we're
hold
moving
on that,
on?
Stella, because I want to make sure that we get through comments on this and then also the housekeeping we still got to get to. So.
Okay, yeah, I've got a comment about police services. So should I hold that until?
Yeah, why don't you hold that
after?
if you could, please?
Okay.
I'll have Carol go right now on resilience.
No, I just have a question. Are we gonna go for another half hour?
I certainly hope not. But I think we're getting close, Carol.
Yes,
I think we probably need about another 15 minutes if you could accommodate us. Does that work for you, Carol?
Yes, to what? 8:45?
Till 8:45.
All right.
Okay. Thank you for keeping us on time there. Okay. Any final comments like police services or Stella, the items that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, so I think we should keep police services in here. I think I saw, Renata, you had emailed that it was absorbed into emergency services, but I mean, it's really a very, very small location or one small area, I think, which maybe agency cooperation, cooperate with other public agencies to ensure adequate medical and other emergency services. And I just saw the whole emergency preparation response section about, kind of large emergencies, natural disasters, fire, flood, earthquake, etc. Whereas the current safety element, police services section, is about our day-to-day crime prevention, enforcement, public safety. And where would that reside if not in this element?
So I think you're right that it does have a place in the safety element. It is the safety element does largely focus on man-made and natural hazards, and people can also be hazards, right? So I think if there are existing policies policies in the current element that you think could be reworked and incorporated, I would maybe suggest still putting them in the emergency preparedness and response section, but we could put in policies surrounding police services. So I'll maybe, if you want to stew on that and get back to me.
Okay.
I think,
yeah, I
that's
can
something we
put together
certainly
some.
accommodate.
Okay, I can put together some thoughts. But yeah, I think that there needs to be some recognition of it, and also just outside of the realm of what's traditionally considered an emergency. You know, big, like activate your EOC and get Cal OES involved and all of that. That we're talking about just plain old everyday need for police services.
Okay. Anything else, Tom?
No, I mean, I think I'll send some more comments along via email.
Okay, thank you. Carol?
Yes, I had the same thought that Stella had, and went through this, but I like it better incorporated, because I think it'd be very misleading to have a section on police services when we're talking about safety. Safety is not being robbed. Safety is how you keep your house from being burglarized, which my house has been done twice. All kinds of things like that. And that is not what this is about. The safety element is really about police services in relation to all the hazards, flood, and everything. It is really not about how to keep your keep you safe from crime, in other words, all the different kinds of crime. So I think it should not be a separate section. People looking at it, police services, that usually implies crime, all kinds of crime, and how to avoid it, and that's not what this is. So I came around that this should be taken out, and anything about the environment, all the hazards, then incorporated under other policies. So I support taking it out as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Okay, we've got a lot of feedback that we've given the consultants and city staff. Stella and I are going to meet with staff tomorrow morning to kind of go through this and make sure we understand all the next steps. So we will keep you in the loop on that. The final thing, we've got two final things. One is if there's any updates from any of the GCAP members of anything that they've done engaging with the community.
Chair, can I interject?
What have I done
two
wrong
small
now?
things? One is just a reminder to please send your written comments no later than end of date, like 5 p.m. Tuesday, the 28th. So I've been talking with PlaceWorks. We want to give time for thoughtful feedback. We really appreciate everything we've heard tonight and all the comments that have already been sent in. But we do want to kind of keep it rolling. So Tuesday feedback.
Tuesday.
Second thing is we want to thank our PlaceWorks folks and release them for the evening. So thank you, Miles and Tammy, for your assistance tonight.
28. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All for the great feedback, and look forward to working with you all soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any committee member activity reports? Going once, twice, okay. The only other housekeeping item we've got listed is the good news is as COVID recedes in the rearview mirror, some of the state rules about allowing meetings on Zoom are going away. And we are going to have to start meeting face-to-face starting in March. That also includes any members of the public that want to talk. They're going to have to come to our meeting spot. We've tried to look at some hybrid solutions to make sure that we get public input, and just due to staffing and some rules that decisions that had to be made, we're not able to do that. So Renata, do you want to go through the details of what an in-person meeting is going to be like, since we're not very familiar with these?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm not as familiar with you, not much more familiar than you all. But so we will be going back to in-person meetings. We will be meeting in the Arts and Sciences Discovery Center at the library. So not the Don Townsend Community Hall, but the kind of classroom near that courtyard, the inner courtyard. So we'll want to talk about kind of devices and if people plan to bring iPads or laptops to review materials. But we'll be keeping our 6 p.m. time on third Tuesday unless there's kind of a scheduling conflict with holidays. Like today, we were pushed because of the Planning Commission. So I think there is definitely the challenge that we'll face about participation in person, but I think that's also a challenge for us to rise to with regards to alternative outreach and engagement. So we have an entire engagement platform, you know, that has been kind of getting dusty and we could utilize. But that we'll be doing that for our next meeting, March 21st, we'll be meeting in person. So we do have the benefit as well of a couple other meetings going in person before us. So we'll get some lessons learned and any bumps ironed out, hopefully before then.
Okay. Any questions about Chris?
I'm going to be out of town for the March 28th meeting, the workshop. And is that going to be available by Zoom, or will the public have to come in person?
Yeah, so basically anything that is like technically a noticed hearing, like a quorum of the body and is a noticed hearing, it has to be in person.
Okay.
So unless we had less than a quorum at the workshop, which I don't think we want, it will have to be in person.
Okay, but it will be on Zoom too?
No.
Oh, so there's no
Entirely in
record
person.
of the meeting that we can go back and look at?
Well, we will be capturing feedback in other ways, similar to like we did in our in-person workshop for the housing element. But yeah, no recording per se.
Okay.
All right, I have a question. GPAT, you wanted comments back by the March 28th
February.
I would like,
on the safety element.
so DPAC member comments on the goals, policies, and programs, I would like by February 28th. We do understand the we do understand the timing of the PTR commission feedback. And so we're happy to receive it March 21st as well, because we'll still be reviewing the full draft safety element.
Okay, but I would like to say that I forwarded all of this to the Park and Rec Commission. All right, and we will have it on our agenda for March 8th. So that feedback will come to you after February 28th.
Yeah, that's okay. We just want to get the bulk of it in as early as we can. The bulk of the feedback.
I just wanted to be sure because we've talked about this being out of sync with the commission.
Yes.
It will be considered. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other housekeeping items? Jim?
Just real quick, just for quorum count purposes, I will not be able to make the next meeting as we're out of country and we are flying back the night of the community workshop, so I won't be able to make that either. So just to give you a heads up.
I will make a note of that. I hope you're going somewhere fun.
We are.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, we will bring this to a closure. Thank you for all of your patience. Sorry I ran over a bit, but we got a lot accomplished and appreciate all your support there. Thank you.
We had all that bank time from the prior meeting, so this is all good.
Yeah, I think I spent it all tonight. So okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Beth.
Thanks
Thanks,
for-
everyone.
Thank you.